Hello, this is NEMYRIALIVE, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy that our guest today is Mark Katz. He is a professor emeritus of political science in George Mason University in the United States of America, and he is a big expert in Russian foreign policy, great power competition, and international conflict. And for over the 3 decades, Professor has studied Soviet and post-Soviet behavior on the world stage. Professor, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's very good to be here.
Thank you. Professor, let's start from the events on the Middle East, because these events was the most burning theme of the last weeks. And let me start from your words on the Durham Forum in 2025. You argue that Russia is becoming more active in the Middle East, even as it is deeply engaged in Ukraine. But, Professor, from the Kiev perspective, it looks like that Russia lose its regional influence in the Middle East if you take into account what's happened in Syria, if you take into account what's happened in Iran. But you have different point of view for this situation, and what is Moscow trying to achieve?
Well, I think these two views are not actually mutually contradictory in the sense that they can become more active but still lose influence. And I think that is what is happening. I think that obviously Putin has spent a lot of time over the course of his reign trying to build Russia's influence in the Middle East. And of course, from 2015, sending his forces to prop up the Assad regime in Syria. And then at the end of 2024, it just collapses. Now, I think that, had Russia not been bogged down in Ukraine, they may have been able to do more to salvage the Assad regime. But I think that this is, the war in Ukraine has really cost them, I think, in terms of Syria. And then, of course, they were reduced to, after having supported Assad and to bomb the people who were in opposition. And then those people in opposition come to power, and the Russians are reduced to asking, oh, by the way, can we keep our bases from which we used to bomb you? And that this government is actually willing to consider it. They obviously don't think of it as a threat. They're playing off, obviously Russia, the West, the other Arab countries as well, to try to get Turkey to get as much as they can. But I think that Russia is obviously instead of being a dominant power in Syria, it's just one of many actors who are competing for favor. And I think also, in terms of Iran, after all Iran did to help Russia in its war against Ukraine, shipping armed drones, missiles, sending advisors, doing whatever. And in this latest crisis, with Israeli and American attacks, what does Russia do for Iran? Nothing. I'm sure the Iranians must be asking themselves, what are they getting in exchange for, the assistance that they gave to Russia? And so I think that that doesn't help Russia's image, I think, in the Middle East. I also think that, please, I don't.
By the way, why do you think that Russia was no so active in this Iran crisis?
I just think that they couldn't. They didn't think they could affect the situation. And to tell you the truth, I don't think they're really unhappy. In other words, that they don't really want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. It wouldn't be the worst thing for them, but they don't really want it to happen. And if the Israelis and the Americans want to undertake the dirty work of preventing the Iranians from doing so. So long as the Iranian regime survives, then the Russians, I don't think, are very sad. And we've seen, what has Russia done? They've expressed solidarity for whatever that's worth, and they've offered to mediate, between Iran on the one hand and the U.S. and Israel on the other. They haven't offered any concrete assistance, not like Iran gave to Russia. So I think from the Iranian point of view, it's all rather disappointing.
Professor, now many says about the special union among China, Iran, and Russia. China, Russia, Iran, it's better, yeah? And maybe North Korea, yeah, we could.
Why not?
Put it, yeah, why not? We could put it together, yeah. What do you think about this special alliance of these 3 or 4 countries? Do you think this is a strategic union and it could have some, I don't know, continuity in future, or it's just a situation where these countries try to find common interests, and in some period it just disappeared everything?
Yeah, well, certainly, I think there's a lot of bilateral cooperation. In other words, North Korea is clearly helping Russia. Iran has helped Russia. China has helped Russia in terms of, its economy and other things. What Russia does for any of these countries, I think, is less clear. They must be sending something to North Korea, I presume. They don't seem to be sending much to Iran. And, I think that for China, it's basically what they gain is that Russia is just becoming more and more dependent on China. That since Putin is so focused on Ukraine and the West, he really can't afford to do anything the Chinese don't want. But, I don't see them doing all that much. I mean, the real odd thing is, why has North Korea sent 10 or more thousand troops to fight? That really is curious that they have done that, and and one wonders just how long they're willing to do this, how many they're willing to send. I mean, presumably for Russians, it's something of an embarrassment, I would think, that North Koreans have to come and defend them. This is not the image of Russia as a great power that helps its lesser allies. That they're depending on North Korea is very strange, and one wonders what would be the impact if they have more North Korean troops. At a certain point, does North Korea exercise a degree of influence over Russian government decision making, kind of like how little Rwanda exercises, a lot of influence in neighboring Congo, which is much larger? One wonders if this is, if Russia is becoming North Korea's Congo in a certain sense. It's very peculiar. I mean, this is not the sort of thing one would expect from a country that claims to be one of the greatest powers in the world. I personally don't think that, there were news stories recently about how, what was it, the Chinese foreign minister, someone, visiting the Europeans and saying that China cannot afford for Russia to lose the war in Ukraine. My question is, can China afford for Russia to win it? In other words, that would not be in China's interest. In other words, that China really does want to have influence in Europe, even has, dreams of drawing it away from the United States, but it can't do this if Russia is seen as a threat, a growing threat to Europe. That basically the Europeans will value China if China can do better than the Americans in terms of keeping Russia away from them. But the question is that, is China willing to do this? I think it could if they just basically made some sort of announcement that, the People's Republic of China demands an immediate ceasefire to the Russian-Ukrainian war, and until it occurs, they will halt all trade with both countries. Well, now that won't really discomfit Ukraine very much, but it will negatively impact Russia. And I would think that Russia, would have to basically accept the ceasefire. Prigozhin, before his death, predicted that the one way he thought that this war could end is if the Chinese sit down, with both the Russians and Ukrainians, and basically say, the war is over, Russia keeps what it's stolen and doesn't get anything more. So Ukrainians keep whatever they have. And that, I think, is, unjust as even that would be, is the most likely sort of end for the conflict, that it will just be a ceasefire. Because, Putin's additional demands are just clearly unacceptable, and dangerous. Any concessions made to Russia, that will lead to just, catastrophic situation. And I think that China has a chance of winning the peace in a certain sense, because obviously what's going to happen is the rush for reconstruction in Ukraine in particular. The West isn't going to do much rushing to help the Russians. Maybe the Chinese will. I don't know, but I think it's the question of who is going to get the contract in Ukraine, and I think China would be, highly competitive. In other words, that there will be a competition between China, the Europeans, the Americans, for all those who understand that there is a competition. And I think it would be very good for Ukraine. In other words, the more that China is involved in Ukraine, obviously, the more it's willing to see Russia restrained. Now, the question is how does the Chinese government perceive its interests? It's believed that Xi Jinping is, partly because of his father, has a very strange love for Russia. It's very peculiar. The Iranian supreme leader is the same. He has this sort of worship of Russia. Unlike a lot of Iranians, unlike a lot of Chinese, that for some reason we have leaders in these countries that see have this very positive image of Russia, and so whereas I think it'd be logical for the Chinese to seek a ceasefire, they haven't quite accepted this logic yet in Beijing. Maybe they'll watch this video and they'll understand what their interests really are.
If we start to say about the possible ceasefire, do you really think that it is possible in the nearest future? And why, if it is really possible?
In the nearest future, I fear no.
Nearest future, let me clarify. Nearest future, it's mean till the end, okay? Or maybe 3-5 months.
Yeah. Well, I think that Vladimir Putin will not accept a ceasefire unless he's afraid that if he doesn't, something worse is going to happen. At a certain point, with the unbelievable casualties that the Russian armed forces are experiencing, the risk is that the Russian army could collapse like it did in World War I. That is a possibility. Or, at some point, will the Russian army, to save itself, overthrow Putin? Or will the strains that Russia is experiencing in Ukraine lead to other problems, whether in the North Caucasus or elsewhere? The way that the Cold War ended was that during the Cold War, Russia experienced a number of problems, like in Eastern Europe, but just one country at a time that could basically, solve them forcefully. Then in 1989, it was region-wide, and then problems with its Marxist allies in the Third World, problems at home. In other words, that there were all these cascading problems that took place. And I think that's the thing, is that if more problems develop for Putin, can he deal with them all? And that, I think, is something. And I think that he won't last forever. I mean, it seems like it, but he can't be. And I would think that for any even someone who comes from his system, the Russian pattern is that each new leader basically reverses a lot of what the previous leader did and blames all the problems that the country is experiencing on the previous leader. And I would think that even if it's someone who comes from within Putin's system, that they might well decide that, look, we've got to stop now, because Putin seems to think that he can outlast everyone else. It's not necessarily the case. That's true, and I think that it would be a prudent Russian leader, even sort of a modernizing authoritarian leader, would basically want to focus on Russia first. Why pursue foreign adventures when they need to rebuild their own economy? Maybe with the idea that later on they can revert to foreign adventures, or at least think about that. But right now, that they need to rebuild their own economy, rebuild their relations, and I think reverse the trend for increasing Russian dependence on China. I think that a rational Russian leader would want to have at least a balance between China and the West. Putin has not, done this. So again, I just don't think that Putin really is acting in Russia's true interests by pursuing this war and allowing Russia to become as dependent as it has become on China, much less North Korea.
In Foreign Affairs in 2023, you say that the West misread Russia. Now Russia is misreading the West. What does it mean, Professor?
Well, I have to admit, I'm not quite sure what I was referring to then. That was obviously before the return of Donald Trump. And I think it's very difficult to read the U.S. government foreign policy for everyone, I think, including in the United States. So right now, I think the situation is, I think Trump came into office thinking that, obviously he really dislikes Biden, and that he really believed that, yes, of course, Putin hated Biden, but when I'm in office, then he'll be willing to make an agreement ending the war in Ukraine. Of course, he said that he could do it in a day. I don't know if Trump ever actually believed that, but I think he thought that Trump himself could work with Putin and things would be okay. And I think what they found over the past few months is that Putin has no desire to end this war. I know there are some American scholars that there are still, being held these dialogues between Russian and Western scholars, whether it's in Istanbul or Belgrade or whatever. And that the reports that I've heard, I haven't done this myself, but people have said that, even back last fall, that Putin understood that Trump was going to be disappointed, and that basically Putin would try to string Trump along, as we would say, as long as he can. That yes, he's willing to listen to Trump, but that he has no desire for a conflict resolution that just ends in a ceasefire. And I think that Trump's idea was that if he showed he was willing to pressure Ukraine, that this would Putin would appreciate this. This would give him an opportunity to back down. In other words, that you offer a concession in anticipation that then someone can make a concession other words, that they want to make a concession to end the war, but they don't want to be the first to do this. So that's what I would think that they may have been Trump's logic, but of course for Putin, no, you make a concession, then I want even more still, and that I think Trump is slowly but surely coming to understand this, and it's something that he did not want to be true. He did, he really wanted this war to end, and unfortunately for Trump, in other words, it's just this is not Putin's idea.
Professor, if we take as example the situation with Iran, do you think this we could understand some strategic steps of Trump? For example, dialogue. After that, pressure, and after that, dialogue.
Right.
Do you think that it is possible in war or Russia's war against Ukraine? Do you think it is possible that Trump could suggest a dialogue with Russia, and after that, pressure, for example, big support with weapons for Ukraine on another steps, I don't know, and after that dialogue? What do you think? Is it possible scenario?
Well, Trump came into office the second time making statements that he was going to pressure both sides, and as we saw, he did pressure Ukraine. But the idea was, the expectation was that Putin would then go along, but Trump indicated that if he didn't, then he could support Ukraine even more than before, and that obviously we haven't seen. In other words, and there was the suspension of arms supplies, then it was restored, and then now, despite the Russian bombing in Ukraine, they again suspended weapons, but then Trump seems to have reversed it just in the past day or so. But nothing in his new budget bill about continuing aid to Ukraine. That doesn't mean it can't occur. I just think that for Trump, he just wants this to be over, and just doesn't see it as logical to continue, and that by that Putin should welcome this opportunity. And after all, because that would be good for Russian business, sanctions would end, and for Trump, doing business, that seems to be what he values, and he believes that everyone else must value that too. But someone, of course, like Putin, that's really not his main interest. He's not so concerned about making money. That's he has these dreams of his image of restoring Russia as a great power, and that that involves controlling Ukraine. And the problem, of course, is that the Ukrainians don't want to be controlled by Russia. So I think that I just think that Putin is simply not behaving in the way that Trump expected him to. And then the question is, what will he do about it when he understands that that's not going to be the case? Now, there's a lot of people and Republicans who have this idea that, well, as bad as the Russians are, we need them against China, and that, again, a rational Russia, in the past, Russia has feared China. We fear China, and we're far away. So if you're right next to China, you should fear China. Well, Putin doesn't seem to do so, or at least he, there was a story about how there are Russian intelligence that they do fear China, and certainly in the past when I did visit Russia, I just wrote, ordinary Russians and educated Russians, they fear China. they don't understand why Putin does not. And so I think that, in other words, a different Russian leader, even a dictator, I think would view Russia's relationship with China very differently than Putin has done. That he is, his behavior is odd, and I think for the Chinese, they understand that Putin is the best thing they have going, and therefore being polite to Putin is essential, and they can do it. They do it. They on the other hand, they drive a hard bargain, as Putin himself acknowledged, in terms of what they buy and at what price from Russia. So I think that we're in a strange situation, and I don't think it's one that can last forever.
It is paradoxically that many years I have interviewed with American experts, and even before this big war, and they explain me that the main task and the main strategy of American foreign policy is to keep Russia far from China. And in the end, they receive absolutely another situation. Absolutely. What was the mistake, or what were the mistakes? Because it is principal question. Because if today is the same, is the same question is important for America, but maybe we need to analyze what mistakes.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right. I think it was a huge mistake, and I think in a certain sense it was wishful thinking. And I think on the part of just a lot of people. I think that China, I think, frightens a lot of Americans because this is the first time we've had a rival that is economically so strong. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union, they saddled themselves with this self-defeating communist economic system. That was good for us. Now, the Chinese, I mean, they have been very successful in the world market. And I think that's something that is especially frightening for a lot of Americans. They can beat us at our own game. Now, personally, I don't think that if you look at Chinese behavior, they're not as threatening as Russia is, in my view. But the potential, in other words, with such a powerful economy, with such a huge population, the potential of China is, if you look at it on paper, of what is Russia's potential, what is China's potential, well, China just looks that much more frightening. And then I also just think that there is this idea that if we think China is frightening, surely the Russians must do so as well, and they have in the past, and that they're going to come to their senses at some point. But that's obviously not happened. I think for Putin, what he fears about the West is that he sees them as instigating color revolution. In other words, whether the West is a threat to Russia, it's a threat. It's just its very existence is a threat to Vladimir Putin system. Whereas China, is a classic great power. It's not trying to reform Russia or make Russia a democracy, not at all. And in that sense, in other words, that however strong China is, it does not pose an internal threat for Russia. It does not support any internal threat to Vladimir Putin, and therefore he can work with it. Now, what might happen in the future? I think for Russians, if you look at their history of their diplomacy, they work with one country against another, but then when the time is right, they work with the other against the first. And I think that what the Russians seem to expect is that if and when China really is a threat to Russia, they can turn to the West, and that the West will help Russia because no matter what else happened, it'll be in their interests to work with Russia against China. And I think that a lot of what Americans, their fear of China has encouraged Russians in this belief, encouraged Putin in this belief. And I think that now, to tell you the truth, I have a feeling that there's a risk that we might treat Russia the same way that Russia treats Iran. That if China really is a threat to Russia, I think there's many in the West who will think, good luck. You can deal with them on their own. We're not helping you after everything you've done. But that's obviously for the future. And I think so long as the Putin Xi Jinping relationship holds, then I think that Russia and China are together. And the Chinese have made no secret. They recently said in Europe, we can't afford for Russia to lose in Ukraine, because then the West would just focus on China. And we've helped create this belief by saying just this kind of thing. And so I think that the other possibility is, why can't the West and China work together against Russia? Russia, a disruptive power. If we can both kind of work together to set the limits on, on Russian ambitions, that Russia would have a very difficult time. And I think that's part of the problem that we have not. Well, certainly, the Trump administration. I mean, it's just sort of a visceral sense that China is our enemy, and therefore other countries, they may be our opponents, but they're also potential allies against China. I mean, that's what they seem to think, but I think it's not true so long as Putin is in power in Russia.
On the contrary, the General Secretary of NATO, Rutte, said a couple of days ago that when China decided to attack Taiwan, Putin will be ready to attack Europe. And it is absolutely another situation, absolutely another understanding of situation. And do you think that it is a real scenario or not?
What I think is that if and when China attacks Taiwan, Russia will do nothing.
Nothing? Russia will do nothing? Nothing?
Yeah, they'll just basically try to keep out of it. And I think, if the war with Ukraine is still going on, then they will focus on Ukraine. But I don't think Putin really wants to risk a wider war with NATO. I think that he would prefer, in other words, it would be in his interest to see China and the US get involved in a conflict. I don't think that he would, at least not immediately move against Europe at this point. I think he's reckless, but I'm not sure he's really foolish. He likes it when other people fight each other. He likes the idea of watching.
But in Atlantic Council in 2023, you say that Moscow sees war in Ukraine not only as a regional struggle, but as a part of global repositioning. If we say about the repositioning, I think maybe in that case, Russia could be interesting to attack Europe just to check how NATO is ready.
Yeah. Well, it might not have to actually attack. In other words, if in fact, God forbid, that Russia prevailed in Ukraine, I think there are a lot of European countries that are going to say, what we have to do is make our peace with Russia. And I think, the Hungarian government, the Slovakian government, I think they're willing to do so. I think that there's other countries that will say, look, I think for the Baltic states in particular, is that if Putin, say, moved against them, it's that maybe we should not send our forces there, but keep them, to fight in our own country. In other words, I don't think that Putin needs to launch a general attack on Europe to destroy NATO. I think that, in other words, if there's a unfortunate outcome in the war on Ukraine, I think that he can just wait for forces in Europe to arise, and even maybe in America, that we have to get along with Russia. That there's that might be better for Putin. In other words, if there are governments that are willing to work with Russia and eliminate sanctions, start buying Russian oil, that they become more like the kind of government Russia wants to see in Kiev, or exists in Minsk. That might be good enough for Putin. At least that's my view. In other words, why risk a wider war when you might get the benefits of it otherwise? That's my opinion.
It is interesting dynamic in opinions towards Russia in Europe, because when this big war among Russia and Ukraine began, many experts say that it's just a regional war, and Russia became weaker and weaker, and in the end, Russia became a weak country, and we will have no problem with Russia. Many experts in Europe say that. But in a year, we have absolutely another understanding of the situation when European leaders just start to say about the possible war with Russia in a couple of years, and they even try to prepare their people in their countries for this war. Does it mean that it was a big mistake, or it is a big mistake in, as you say, is understanding of Russia and in understanding of strategy, not only Russia, but in strategy of Russia plus China plus, I don't know, North Korea or something else? What do you think? How it could happen that it is dramatically changed the understanding of situation and the role of Russia?
Well, I think that the return of Trump has a lot to do with this. In other words, that I think that for the Europeans, I think that they hoped that Russia's would just be bogged down in Ukraine, and of course the Europeans have helped Ukraine, the Americans have too. But that so long as the Americans continue to help Ukrainians, in other words, the fighting would be limited to Ukraine. Now, with Trump raising the possibility that maybe U.S. assistance to Ukraine won't continue, and maybe he might not even defend Europe, then suddenly I think there's been an understanding that they may have to defend themselves, and and this I think is very difficult. I think that during the Cold War, especially in the years after the Cold War, the Europeans, especially the West Europeans in particular, got used to the idea that this was a peaceful new world coming into being, and that whatever threats did exist, well, there were the Americans, and they wanted to have the best of both worlds. But they wanted to have American defense, but to be able to buy Russian petroleum, trade with China, whatever threat Russia posed, well, the Americans were there to help them. And now I think that they're waking up to the idea that, well, maybe they're on their own. And of course, there's all these different European governments, the European Union itself. It's very difficult it doesn't really have a common defense policy. And these are countries with aging populations. They've done away with conscription in most of these places. They don't want to have to do this, but they don't want to have to do what Ukraine has done. And so I just think that it's a wake up call, but it's like they're very they're hoping that this is just going to somehow end, and I think that that is unfortunate, and maybe as a result, if Putin really does want to push things, in other words, it's like he would do things in one country at a time. after Ukraine, I think the next one is obviously Moldova. That would just be easy, not a NATO member, so tiny. And then possibly the Baltics, very small populations. Is NATO really going to defend them or not? I would hope so, but I think that it would not be a generalized Russian attack on Europe, but just one thing at a time, and forcing countries. In other words, who wants to get involved? In other words, there are some countries I think that would not. In other words, that all alliances, are, when it comes down to it, they're coalitions of the willing. And just because there's a formal NATO alliance doesn't mean when the crunch comes that everyone will be willing. And there's the legal obligations have a way of not being taken seriously, when war actually comes. In other words, it's that no one goes to war because they don't want to, but they're legally obligated that they'll do. No, they'll find a way not to do so. And so that I think is a possibility.
Professor, you spent many years to study Russia as well as Soviet and post-Soviet countries. And do you think that now is a real and right understanding of Russia possibilities and Russia's perspectives? What I mean, for example, from one hand, we speak about Russia, which is strong and ready to continue the war, and that it could attack any other countries. It's from one hand. From the other hand, we have situation when Russia lose its influence on the Middle East. I don't know what you say about the role and weight of Russia in South Caucasus, and what about Central Asia, for example? And from one hand, many say that Russia is strong, but from the other hand, we see that Russia have problem. But we know that Russia have economic problem as well. And in that case, it is interesting it looks like a disbalance in all this understanding of Russia. And next one story is about global South countries, because as I understand, Putin expected that he could become a leader of these countries, and it was very important for him. But now we see that it is absolutely another story. And it is absolutely different situation for Russia and different understanding of Russia. I think it is interesting situation.
Yeah, it's very curious, and certainly the global South, which the Russians always seem to refer to as the global majority. There is that because they don't see themselves as part of the South. That they're
of course.
They're Europeans, but they're part of the global majority. And I think that this, as we saw this BRICS summit, I mean, it's there's three anti-American governments, basically, Russia, Iran, China. But the rest, as the Indian Prime Minister put it, they are non-Western, not anti-Western. There was that the rest of them want to continue trading. In other words, that they want to, they're not going to join the West in isolating Russia, but they're not going to join Russia in its campaign against the West either. And so I think that it's as we've seen in the Middle East, it's difficult for Russia. Russia is just sort of one external great power among others. It doesn't seem to have a very dominant position. And I think, elsewhere too, Chinese influence in Africa and Latin America, I think, is far greater than Russian influence, maybe in the Sahel. But, Russia, just like during the Cold War, in other words, where does it appear to be strongest in the developing world? in countries that are weakest and poorest. In other words, that countries that seek, these Sahelian countries that are facing, jihadist opposition. And the thing is that the Russians may have displaced the French, they have displaced the Americans, they haven't defeated the jihadists, and that's, in fact, in many places it seems to have gotten worse. So that's the thing, is that their ability to actually influence the situation is difficult. And for those who are looking for economic gains, well, China is the one that offers that, not Russia. And of course, there's others involved: Turkey, India. Of course, the West is still active. That Russia, it's not so easy for the Russians. That their friends there are not exactly, sort of friends that are really worth having necessarily. So yeah, I think you point to something important, that Russia, certainly it has projected this image of strength, and obviously Ukrainians are feeling the brunt of what strength the Russians do have. But it's their focus on Ukraine, I think, has led to them being less able to be influential in other parts of the world. And not because other parts of the world, unfortunately, they're not so sympathetic toward Ukraine, but just because, well, what can they get from Russia? In other words, a lot of developing countries, well, they wanted arms without any strings attached. Well, Russia, before seemed like a good bet. Yeah, you can buy Russian weapons. They work. They're cheaper. No strings attached. And now it's like, well, can you actually get them from Russia? Because they need weapons themselves. And are they all that good? The Ukrainians have really undermined the reputation of Russian weaponry. And, I think, and certainly, read articles here about how the Ukrainian defense industry is now essentially serving as a model for the world. In other words, that Western firms need to start studying, what the Ukrainians have done themselves. And there's a lot of these big, expensive weapons turn out to be useless compared to different kinds of armed drones, which are much cheaper. And the Russians don't seem to. In other words, that the Ukraine war has hurt the reputation of Russian weaponry, as has their withdrawal from Syria. In other words, it's like even Arabs who didn't like Assad, they saw Russia as defending their ally, unlike the Americans who abandoned theirs. Well, Putin did abandon an ally, and it hasn't done much for their friends in Iran either. In other words, just what good are they in the crunch if they're not going to do anything for someone whom they invested so much as they did in Assad in Syria? Well, what are they going to really do for anybody else? So I think that I think that for a lot of global South countries, in other words, that when they look at sort of geopolitics, it's like what they want is what all of them wants is external support against their immediate neighbors, and they're happy to get support from everyone if they can do that. But if they can't, they'll settle for one. And now Russia just isn't as much in that game. In other words, what can they get from Russia? I remember I was in listened to a Zoom conference in which a Saudi scholar just talked about how in the Middle East, Russia is now a minor power. And this is from a country where, they've cultivated the Russians partly to make the Americans jealous, or I think, but and that's disappointing to them. They would like Russia to be able to be more active, and that's also something, in the old days during the Cold War, people feared the Soviet Union. In the global South, people don't fear Putin. In other words, it's like, is he useful or not? But it's not a question of they see him as a fearful figure in their part of the world. And unfortunately, they have this idea that whatever happens in Ukraine, it just doesn't affect them. So, and that is unfortunate.
Professor, when will China and Russia become enemies? If we look for the real situation, the situation on the ground, we see that Russia is losing its influence in different regions and China is taking over. In other words, China and Russia have many interests that overlapping and even clash. What will make Russia and China enemies?
Yeah, well, I think the Chinese have been just so careful about not offending the Russians, but that I think that in certain places, I think Central Asia in particular, their influence really is growing, and that Russia's sort of left with sort of having to smile and sort of accept
Mhm,
the new situation. I mean, the one thing I think the Russians have going for them is that a lot of the old, whether it's inherited from the Soviet Union, in other words, the governing structure in Central Asian countries tends to be still, Russian educated, have contacts with Russia, and they are fearful of China. And to that extent, the Russians, that's useful for Russia. But I think that one thing that's very clear is that you know America, the West, Central Asia is just too far away. We can't protect Central Asia either against Russia or China. Uh, and so I think that Russia and China are there on their own, and you know, but what Russia also benefits from is that China is looking at Taiwan, is looking at the South China Sea, that it's not as focused on Central Asia as it is on. And again, in other words, that both Russia and China right now, they're each focused on their rivalries with the West, not on their rivalries with each other. But that, we've seen in the past that um, rivalry with one another can take place. And I would think that leadership change in either Russia or China, especially both, could result in very different situation. Uh, but it's and I in these reports that Russian intelligence is fearful of what the Chinese are doing in Russia indicates that there are those in Russia who are on the lookout. They're anticipating a future in which there's rivalry between Russia and China that actually exists now. So they're not allies, they're not friends. They're merely useful to each other at present.
And the last question, Professor, but this question is very important for Ukrainians. What do you think about real scenarios for Russia's Ukrainian war? I mean, stop, continue, or something else?
What I want is for it to stop.
Yes,
uh,
yes. Thank you. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Me too.
yeah. What I think is that I remember reading something in the national interest is that the real question is who's going to outlast who? Are the Russians on the one hand, or Western support for Ukraine? And unfortunately, we've seen the Trump administration call into question Western support for Ukraine, but Europeans seem to be wanting to continue. I also think that when it comes down to it, Trump cannot afford to see Ukraine lose.
Lose.
That
To see
yeah,
Ukraine lose.
yeah, he
It
cannot
is.
afford that. In other words,
Mhm.
it's like uh, you know, as much as he criticized Biden about Afghanistan, and Biden
Afghanistan.
was just essentially uh, implementing the deal that Trump had signed with the Taliban. In other words, this was, and once Trump signed that deal, and Biden agreed to abide by. What happened in Afghanistan was inevitable. There's no question about it. But Afghanistan, in other words, here was a government that couldn't even motivate its own forces to fight to defend it. Ukraine, it's different. In other words, Ukrainians are fighting for their own defense. If they fall, whoever no American leader is going to avoid being blamed. And it's public opinion polls in the U.S. show that the majority of Americans want to support Ukraine. They don't really understand Trump's gains when it comes to Ukraine, and so I think that he would be blamed. This could really hurt his whole movement if Ukraine is seen to be defeated. And I think that when it comes down to it, if Putin does not behave in a way that Trump expects, that will make Trump angry. And we will see he will, in fact, start to provide more assistance to Ukraine at some point, if only to maintain his own image here at home, because he does not want to be seen as weak. In other words, that would be very bad for Trump. So, and also basically, I think that, in other words, you might say, okay, well, wouldn't Trump be embarrassed by reversing course on Ukraine? Probably not, and nor would his supporters. In other words, it's a lot of them are just focused on what Trump wants. In other words, if Trump changes his mind, that sounds fine. To them, they would go along with whatever he says. And Democrats are going to want to support Ukraine anyway. They're not going to stop. If Trump supports Ukraine, then we don't know. They're going to want to continue supporting Ukraine as well. Now, how I think will this end? I personally think I've long thought that it's just going to end with a ceasefire in place. That's what is going to happen, and that what I think has to happen is we have to look at Ukraine like we did South Korea. In other words, we're going to have Western troops, if Ukraine wants them, in Ukraine, and just like in South Korea, right up at the demilitarized zone, basically. That deployment of Western troops to Ukraine is going to be needed. Whether Ukraine's a member of NATO or not is irrelevant. It's going to have to be. This, I think, is going to be needed, and I don't see any other way to keep in other words, if you have a ceasefire, to keep the ceasefire in place, because if there aren't Western forces in Ukraine, and Putin basically uses the ceasefire as an excuse to rebuild his economy, Western countries start trading with Russia, he'll want to start the war once again. So I think there has to be, Putin wants all these limits on Ukraine. These are unrealistic. The real limits have to be on Russia. And it may be that Putin himself, would never agree to that. And that's why I think, we have to look to a successor leader. That's the real issue, is that at a certain point, in other words, does the Russian security services, have they had enough? They have no love for Ukraine, but they have great love for themselves. In other words, is this damaging? Is the continuation of this war damaging Russia irreparably? And I would think that there's an argument to be made that, let's just stop with Ukraine now. Maybe we'll, resume later, whatever. But for right now and for several years, we don't need this anymore. And I would think that that's the way the war is probably going to end. There's some kind of change occurs in Russia, but when or how that's going to take place, I don't know. But certainly, Putin, I think, has been humiliated. All these Ukrainian attacks in various parts of Russia, and I think they're going to continue. That's the thing. In other words, like for a small power like Ukraine, the U.S. has had experience when you're fighting small countries. They don't have to win to win. They just have to not lose. There's just to survive. And that's the thing. I think that Russia, by not winning, that's very bad for Putin. And it's like he can bring in all these conscripts, but it's very wasteful of human life. And at a certain point, if you're there on the Russian side of the front line, and basically you're going to die, either because you're killed by the Ukrainians or you're killed by the Russian security services because they don't think you're fighting, or you're going to commit suicide. Those are the three sort of avenue choices you have. There's a fourth choice. That is, turn your guns on your own officers. That if you're going to die anyway, they're going to go with you. And that's how armies fall apart. And I would not be surprised if that happens at a certain point. It will be very difficult to control it. And at a certain point, officers have to make a choice: is that, are we better off? Just for our own survival, are we better off suppressing our own forces or joining them? And so it'll be a very, it's nothing idealistic. It's just where do we have the better chance of survival? And I suspect that might happen at some point.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you.